This year the PSA celebrates its centenary. Though the union officially came into being in 1913, its story really begins at the end of the 19th century. Starting in 1890, public servants made several attempts to form an organisation that could unite and represent them. These early organisations didn't attract many members, and each lasted only a few years. In 1912, the Public Service Act was passed, creating the role of a Public Service Commissioner who would have the power to appoint, promote and dismiss public servants and set salaries. The Act highlighted the need for a strong and united employees' organisation. In 1913, 3 young Education Department clerks, Frank Miller, Tom Gilbert and Roland Bremner, decided to form an association to provide ordinary public servants with the support they needed. The New Zealand Public Service Association was formally incorporated on the 31st of October 1913. Pay and conditions were very poor, health and safety was non-existent. In 1915, a 16-year-old, Clem Goddard, joined the pension department as a cadet. He was trained as a pay clerk, and as he recalled in the PSA journal 50 years later, all we had then as cash safeguard was an old Smith & Wesson revolver, which I handled with great care. The early years of the PSA were difficult. Public servants were often forced to take pay cuts when the economy stalled. The new organisation was strongly focused on personal service to members and swiftly boosted its membership. By 1918, the PSA could afford a paid General Secretary, and the energetic Frank Miller got the job and an office in Wellington's Lambton Quay. Under Miller's leadership, PSA membership grew to 20,000. He was still General Secretary and PSA Journal editor when he died on the 4th of September 1944. The 1920s were also difficult years for the PSA and public servants. Salaries were cut and 1,100 public servants were sacked out of a total force of 7,353. Those who did keep their jobs found it hard to live on their meagre salaries. In 1928, the PSA set up a money club, the Public Service Investment Society, to help out members with cheap loans and prevent them falling into the clutches of moneylenders. For most of the century, the PSIS would play a significant part in the lives of PSA members. At 10:47 a.m. on the 3rd of February 1931, a 7.8 magnitude earthquake shook Hawke's Bay, devastating Napier and Hastings. Public servants and their families were among the hundreds who died and the thousands that were injured. Within a fortnight, the government announced public service salaries were to be slashed by 10%. The PSA reacted immediately, joining with post office, railways and teacher unions to form the Combined Services Organisation. Despite their united opposition, the cuts went ahead. With the election of the first Labour government in 1935, the PSA began to have some success with its advocacy for public servants. A 5-day working week for public servants was introduced, salaries were restored to 1931 levels, and public servants given the right to become politically involved. During the late 1930s and early 1940s, the PSA and the Public Service Commission enjoyed a close relationship, which some members felt was a bit too cosy. A left-wing ginger group called the Korero, led by feisty activist Jack Lewin, sought to wrest control of the union from the old guard and make it more responsive to rank-and-file members. The Korero wanted action. Pay was lagging behind private sector rates, and women had waited decades for equal pay. In 1946, Jack Lewin was elected president. Under his vigorous leadership, the union became an independent and an effective force. When he died in 1990, the PSA Journal observed, Without Jack Lewin, the PSA might still be a gentleman's club instead of the real trade union it is today. In 1950, the PSA moved into its own modest building in Wellington at 132 The Terrace. On the 8th of August 1955, Clem Goddard retired. He'd served in the pensions department, later social welfare, through 2 world wars, the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 and the Great Depression. When he began his career, the public service was an all-male preserve. Looking back, he observed, "Girls are now so much part of our setup that we could hardly carry on the work without them. Their entry probably made the biggest difference in the service of all the changes I can remember." But they were not being paid the same as men. With the growing prosperity in the country, women in the PSA began to campaign for equal pay for women. They travelled round the country, talking to branches, holding meetings, and using the appeal system to challenge their lower maximum salary. The pressure paid off. In 1960, the government passed the Government Service Equal Pay Act, though there was still a long way to go. It would be remiss to leave the 50s without mention of the PSA's role in the fashion crime of the century. In 1958, the PSA lobbied the State Services Commission to allow the wearing of walk shorts at work during the summer months. The Commission agreed, with the proviso that long socks, shirts and ties also be worn. It was the thin edge of the wedge. Soon walk shorts in every hue and tartan and check and polyester and cord became the standard uniform for many male public servants, regardless of the season. When the PSA celebrated its half-century in 1963, it had grown to become a strong and confident organisation. Under the leadership of General Secretary Dan Long, the union was widening its horizons, becoming active in the international trade union movement. In 1967, PSA objectives widened to include the promotion and protection of economic, social, industrial and educational interests of members, including their civil rights. In 1969, the first holiday home was bought in Otimatata and North Otago. It was the first of 7 around the country, a PSA benefit that proved very popular with members. Labour unrest and political protest marked the 1970s, and the PSA and its members were often in the thick of it. The Vietnam War, French nuclear testing, the SIS bill, and apartheid were some of the issues that got people on the streets. 1974 saw the normally mild dental nurses take to the streets. They had been waiting years for a pay increase. They marched on Parliament, accompanied by PSA leaders. After an hour and a half of face-to-face negotiations with the Prime Minister Norman Kirk and State Services Minister Bob Tizard, the nurses got their long overdue pay increase. In 1975, a national government led by Robert Muldoon was swept into power on a policy of being tough with trade unions. It was the beginning of a decade of industrial strife as government and unions clashed. It wasn't long before the PSA became a target. In 1979, Muldoon threatened to de-recognise the PSA after electricity workers took industrial action that resulted in power cuts. The threat brought a storm of protest from PSA members and other unionists, and the government backed down. The threat, however, caused a run on funds of the PSIS, which was already in financial trouble. It was placed in statutory management and its assets frozen. The 1980s started well for the PSA. It had seen off the threat of de-recognition. It had moved into its own building, PSA House, and membership had passed 68,000. When a Labour government was elected after the snap election in 1984, there was jubilation. The wage freeze ended and workers received long overdue pay increases. The elation, however, was short-lived. The Labour government embarked on a neoliberal programme of radical social and economic reform that seemed like a betrayal to many of their supporters. In 1988, the State Sector Act was passed. It left in its wake a fragmented, corporatised public service. 5,000 public servants lost their jobs. The PSA was plunged into crisis with the loss of half its membership and hundreds of new employment agreements to negotiate. The 80s, however, were not all doom and gloom. The union was growing in maturity, if not in numbers. In 1988, Sue Piper was elected president, the first woman to lead the union in its 75-year history. In the years that followed, more women took up leadership roles in the union. Maori participation also increased throughout the 80s. In 1988, PSA structures were changed to allow more representation for Maori members. In the 90s, the assault on the public sector continued. The newly elected national government in 1990 continued Labour's free market reforms, cutting welfare benefits and introducing user pays. In 1991, the government sought to marginalise unions with the Employment Contracts Act that allowed anyone, not just a union, to negotiate on behalf of employees. The PSA sought to regroup and in 1993 amalgamated with the Northern and Central local government unions. The PSA launched a review of its operations. It adopted a new strategy, Partnership for Quality, with the aim of engaging with employers to deliver quality jobs for members and quality services for the public. By the end of the 90s, the union had largely recovered. It had a new constitution, secretariat and branch structure, and membership was rising. The Labour-led government, elected in 1999, began the task of rebuilding the public service. The PSA that entered the new century was very different from the one Clem Goddard joined in 1915. Women now make up 68% of a membership spread across the country in government departments, hospitals, local government, community agencies and state entities. The challenges remain. But in remembering its people and its past, the union can look forward to the next century with confidence.